publicly more than 300,000 collections. So if you know Postman, some of you might not know, so I have to explain that a collection is a group of API requests, right? So like I said, imagine that I need to do some experiments with Slack, reading some channels, archiving some channels. What do? Go to the Slack API website, start reading documentation, start preparing my mockup. Ideally, what I would want is to find Slack on Postman, right? Because my end goal is to experiment with an API. Everything I do until I experiment is boilerplate, right? Is, oh, how do I test this, evaluate this? So a lot of companies have figured out that what developers do when they find the documentation is open Postman to create a request to evaluate the API. So isn't it much better if Slack just provides their whole collection here on the side, and this is our web interface if you're not familiar with, and just pretty much have any single endpoint and operation I have listed on Slack. And this is managed by Slack. If I want to reuse this, I could copy it to my own personal workspace and start playing with it. But Postman actually has a concept of forking. And I'll go into this a bit later. So it's a bit like a repository today. You don't download a zip file of a repository and keep it on your machine, right? You clone it. And then if there's updates tomorrow, you update it, you fetch the changes and you pull and merge the changes in. You can do this with Postman today. So if I fork this Slack library to my own workspace, to my own private space, I can start playing with it. I can start experimenting with it. I can change and add a few folders for my particular use cases, workflows, and then I might not touch it for 2 years. And then in 2 years' time, I just click a button and take the latest changes, right? Documentation is important, and a lot of these, you go to the Slack API website and it has very good documentation, but documentation seems like the fine tuning of an API. If I can get 99% of what I want just from coming here to the web admin and say, okay, let's get the list of conversations, and this is how I get them. And as some of you will know, there's even ways to generate the test automatically for my language. So if I just want to mock up this very quickly into my application, I can just come here and copy paste the code just to call this endpoint, right? Or I can evaluate it directly here. So,
sorry, Mama.
And can you mute? Okay. That's I actually know who that is, but I will say in the end of the presentation. So again, if you have these at arm's reach, you will go to documentation when you need to. So then you ask, for example, PayPal is another example. This doesn't replace documentation or developer portals. There are other things you have to do in developer portals. But look at Postman, which is such a great example of someone that completely embraced the Postman journey. If you go to their API page, you see this is our REST API and something and something and something. And then you see this running Postman button. So this is literally in their first section or the first header of their API page is a button that if I click it, which I will, it's actually going to automatically fork their collection into my workspace. It's not even going to the collection. They really want me to get the PayPal API as fast as I can in my workspace, because then I can play with it, I can change it, because it's my fork, right? I can play with my fork. So a lot of companies are doing this. They understand that if we provide people with just a bunch of documentation here, they're just trying to find their fastest way into evaluating this API, which for a lot of people, 25 million users, is Postman, right? So this collaboration and this idea of collaboration is a lot of the times developers gravitate to the second part of my presentation when I'm hacking and I'm coding and I'm doing some APIs. But to me, this is the fundamental value of Postman, is the ability to collaborate and to comment on each other's APIs, to take an API either from the open source community like PayPal or Slack, or we have our own enterprise team of Postman, and let's imagine that we integrate a lot with Azure in our company. I imagine a lot of you have either a cloud provider or a third-party public API then to integrate a lot with. I started thinking in all the time I spent in GitHub, how many times did I recreate the same API request or just the same one with a little change that I had to do again and again and again and again, because there wasn't a place where my colleagues and I could just archive all of those requests in collections, saying, hey, here's all the possible API requests you can do to fetch repositories from GitHub. And instead of having to do it all over again, I'll just go to our private collection, and I'll talk a bit about the private API network in a second, and reuse from there, iterate from there. And like you saw the pool changes, I can actually make a change to that Slack API, make a change to the PayPal API, and submit a pull request like you do for code, and say, hey, I think I found a better example for your response API. Why don't you take this on board? And you can actually do this within your close circle. And this is what a lot of customers are finding. Thus, you saw the growth in adoption of customers and not just users. Let me go now to the Postman app. Postman can be used, obviously, as you probably know, on the browser or on the desktop. I'm going to move to the desktop client, and you have here the Explore page. And the Explore is the public collaboration channel, right? This is where I will find WordPress. This is where I find these 300,000 collections of APIs that I can fork and I can play with and I can experiment, right? But we have two other collaboration channels. The private API network, which is basically, okay, so we here in this room are all part of a small startup. We are creating our APIs and we have specific additions on top of public APIs that we don't necessarily want to share. So that is the private API network. And there is actually partner workspaces, which is kind of, I believe, a unique way to collaborate with third parties without granting them access to everything you have on your private API, but just to do collaboration with other companies in just a single workspace, which you can co-create or support other people from other companies in that workspace. But I want to go in here into the private API network to kind of showcase the type of collaboration as I was illustrating for public APIs to private APIs. So the private API network is basically a place where any developer using Postman can suggest an administrator to publish it in this, which we think it's a curated wall. You can, like any other platform, you can come here into the global search and start searching for APIs in your private team. But if there are a certain series of APIs like week one onboarding, authentication APIs, anything you might think, workspaces with best practices, with enablement, tutorials for new engineers that join in, you can kind of index them in a curated wall. And there is a specific role that allows you to get APIs into this space. So the private API network will allow you to index APIs, collections, and workspaces, and it's kind of the first go-to place. And if you cannot find that, you would probably go into the to the global search to try and kind of find something else that has not been published in the private API network. But again, in terms of collaboration, if one thing we started being better at code in terms of inner sourcing and reusability is try to reuse before build or leverage before build or augment before build new. And I believe that if developers have the platform to search for something that might be prior art that either completely solves your problem, which is the ideal scenario, which doesn't happen a lot of the times, but sometimes there is the time where you find that API that just needs a small change. And this prevents you from building another one, from fixing the same bugs. And I truly believe I've spoken, inner source is one of my favorite topics in the industry, and I speak a lot about it. And I truly believe that although it's not something that you can attain super quick, is something that the network effects of people coming together and collaborating is massive. So I will probably stop here just for a minute because I'm going to start focusing on what happens when you actually don't find the API to leverage and you want to build a new one. And this is what I think developers probably gravitate more towards because they see people writing code and that's more fun. So before I go into how we distinguish the producer and the consumer when you're dealing with APIs, you're either creating or leveraging, consuming, and going into creating an API from the ground up. Any questions on the room so far? I'll take 1-2 questions, and then we have questions in the end as well. Anything on the room? Yeah, just it's a nice pause for you don't need to hear my voice for the whole. Yes, we have that, and I will be doing that now. So you can do that directly on the API, and you'll see me doing that. The button is Generate API Definition. And there are tools out there. If you're not building the API in Postman, oh, no. Folks realize that there's socks for questions now, so there's Nigel says only 4 pairs. But if you have the spec outside of Postman and you don't necessarily want to create the API, what I'm just about to do, because it's probably a bit of overhead for you, there are tools out there that we can talk about later and I can show you that will do that conversion for you if you just have the file and you don't want anything other than just the collection. So one thing I do a lot today, I do a lot these days, and I won't be doing the whole flow, is picking up the idea of an API and push it all the way through production, right? Trying to simulate as close as a realistic enterprise scenario that you can actually do in about an hour. So I really like this diagram. We leverage quite this at Postman, which shows where you are in your API lifecycle. So if I'm creating a new API from the ground up, I'll probably be looking at the definition of the API that a business person has written with a product owner. And then when it comes to the design, and the design, we state the design as the contract and defining, translating the requirements into a contract that can be leveraged to developers to implement develop that contract, implement that contract, and then do automation testing, use our governance and security rules to kind of adhere to best practices, and then the deployment observability with Postman monitors, and then the distribution changes for every company, but you can again publish them to the private API network, or if it's public API network, and then other people, your consumers, will go into the right side. And the scenarios I was saying is critical for a lot of companies today are these two: the discovery, evaluate, right? Which is, again, do you need to go to an API documentation to experiment an API, to evaluate an API? I think those days are in the past. You want to find the ready-made collection to just hit it and see if it does what you need to be done. So today, what I do generally, and I will do a part of it today, is pretending that I just get to work. Today is a Wednesday, so I have several APIs here that I play with and I implement. So let's imagine that there's an API that asks us to create a new user, retrieve a user, update a user, and list all users. This is a very simple, crude API. I call it the policyholder API. And let's imagine that this morning I get to work and I get asked to implement this. So the first thing I would have done is search for this API, right? Because who knows, my company is so big, there might be something that I can just reuse. And if there's not something I can reuse immediately, maybe there's something I can leverage or contribute to so that it gives me what I want. So if you have the tool there or the ability to search, I think people will at least try and see inspiration and try to reach out to other people in other teams to understand if this serves for them. I've made this API before, so it is part here of the Innovation Labs workspace. And if I come if I click it, you get dropped down to the collection, and this would be the best case scenario, right? There's actually an API that seems to be doing this, and I can come here and I can check if any environments associated with it. And if I don't have the permissions, I fork it, right, to test this myself. Or if I think it's pretty much what I need, I can just come here into the comments and I can say, Elio, I need to use this API. Can we talk about production load, etc. Okay, and obviously Postman provides you like the social collaboration features that allow you for the conversation to be next to the API. So we don't move the conversation to email. This person, which I know is a contributor to this API, I might not know where they are physically, which team do they work on, but this is, again, establishing that parallel with code. A lot of the times you go find a library and you don't know any of the authors, but you're just one issue away or one mention away for starting that conversation. And this is kind of in the center of the collaboration. But let's imagine I don't find this API, so I actually have to build it. And what I'll do for the next 20 or 30 minutes is kind of explain how Postman gravitates toward that producer lifecycle that you might not know about because it's not as old as some of the other stuff. One thing I want to show you here is how many of these collections, because I told you about it, but I didn't show you in practice. Let me see if I can zoom this a bit. I will lose the right side menu at some point. Yeah. So you see how many of these collections are forked. So they have the kind of the branching icon. This means that very few of these collections was actually created by me here. And if you see, for example, on the GitLab fork, the fork only contains this v3 folder. The other two folders are things that I've started augmenting. And I took this from the public network. For example, I use OpenAI a lot for a lot of tests, and I imagine you do. And if there is an update, you can see here, for example, the Postman API, which I use a lot, obviously. You can just come here and see, okay, it seems like there are some changes pending because you can see the pull changes has the down icon. And instead of going again to the internet, checking the documentation, downloading another collection, checking with someone if this is updated to date, I just click pull changes. And this should be very natural for developers in the audience, in the sense that it's just telling you a delta of everything that has changed. So you can see how many add points is changed. We're adding a lot of functionality, especially these years, we'll be shipping quite a lot. So you can see how much has changed since I've last updated this API. So I can just say pull changes, and now I have the most up-to-date version of the Postman API. The important thing to understand is that this doesn't happen just to public stuff. I could have forked this API from the private API network. It could have been our golden authentication API. And I never have to recheck anything again. If I need to use this or leverage this today, the first thing I do before I do anything like you would do to a library is check here if there's any changes to be pulled, right? And for a lot of the collections you have, you'll also get notifications. For example, you can see here today, I get a notification saying that the Postman API has been changed. So I get back to this collaboration aspect of it because to me it is fundamental and it is the big X factor of Postman, the collaboration around APIs and the reusability and the non-duplication of work. But like I promised, let's imagine that we're going to create this API based on that Jira definition. I have what I believe is needed to finish that, and I'm going to start working on that. Postman for a long time, going back to the origins, was the first icon on the top left. This one I'm hovering over, right? This was collections, right? You only had collections. That's it. Right, put some requests in here, some endpoints, group them into folders. Those are your collections. As you can see, and we won't be touching all of this today, but Postman has grown quite a lot. So the API tab is the creator playground. This is for the person trying to create a new API. So let's imagine that, okay, it's Wednesday morning, I saw the Jira ticket, I had my breakfast, I had my coffee, I'm going to try and create this new API. So I'm going to call it policy holder. And immediately, might have to zoom this out a bit. And immediately you see, that Postman is asking me, you're just about to create what is code for all matters. Do you want to sync this to any of your repositories? And we encourage customers to do so because, as you'll see, there's a lot of things you will leverage from Postman itself when you integrate the whole flow with your CI/CD pipelines. So for this example, I'm going to choose GitHub because, as I said, you probably guess I'm quite familiar with it. So I'm just going to choose a repository that I have, which is pretty much only has a README and nothing else. And it's searching all of the repositories in this organization. And I'm going to select a branch. And as you imagine, I probably wouldn't be able to commit to push to main anyway. So I'm going to create a new branch from main, and I'm going to call it meetup. So we're going to do a branch-based or a pool-based development. And again, this is greenfield. The repository is empty. So I'm going to let Postman store the metadata wherever Postman is suggesting, which is those two folders, Postman schemas and Postman collections. But if this was something, and I try to convey this to a lot of customers that have a lot of legacy APIs, if the repository has schemas in there and collections in there, you can just find the folder on these two menus. So it's not just for greenfield stuff. So I connect the repository, and from now on, Postman will act as a native Git client, which you're very used to use either in VS Code, JetBrains, you name it, right? So you expect to see that bottom bit there with the branch. You see the branch sign here, and we, for example, the choices we made in terms of metadata are already ready to commit. So I'm just going to say initial metadata, right? Commit and push, and those are back to GitHub, right? So meetup created less than a minute ago. So this is the repository. So we're working on that branch. So this seems to me and has always been very familiar to me in terms of developer workflow. Like Postman is the place where it is the platform, or in this case, we're treating it more as a tool in the creator space that understands APIs, right? The same way that yes, you can commit a binary file to Git if you're working on game assets, but you would probably use a visual game editor instead of VS Code, right? Because it understands the domain it's working on. This is the home of the API. You would put here a description that will then be added to the documentation on the top. We don't have any collections yet. This is the generation part we're going to be talked about. And the definition is what I want to work on now. There are 4 big sections here on the right. The connected repository, which you can see is the one I just showed. Test and automation, we're going to touch this very soon. And there's a part for deployments to integrate with AWS Gateway, APG, Azure API Management, and the API performance for tools like Datadog, etc. So Tuesday, I just did this in a Wednesday morning. 5 minutes have passed. I'm very used to doing this, and I'm going to author this definition from scratch. So I'm going to be working on an API definition. You can see here how the breadth of support for in Postman today. So not just OpenAPI. And I usually say, if you're not familiar with definitions, OpenAPI, gRPC, Async API, you would probably want to start with a boilerplate to kind of get your toes wet with the syntax. And actually, when I started using Postman a while back and starting using this functionality, this is how I got to kind of get to learn OpenAPI, and then I went to the traditional kind of courses and books. This is obviously a placeholder where you can see here some of the endpoints that this placeholder generates, but I have to implement what was on that Jira ticket, right? So this is not going to be 2 minutes of work, is it? And so I'm going to get here a file that I have on VS Code, which is a starting point. So I'm going to copy paste that whole file in here. And let's imagine that this was my Wednesday. It's 5 p.m. on Wednesday, and I just finished this. And you can see here on the left, the paths. I have a post to create the new policyholder, a get to retrieve all policyholders, and then by ID, I can edit one and get a specific policyholder. So I spent a lot of time on the contract. And this is quite important in the sense that you will be able, as you'll see, you'll be able to leverage a lot from the contract. For folks asking me, can I implement an API without a contract? Yes, you can. And I think the benefits will be, you will understand the benefits of this like in 10 minutes. But can you build a house, a physical house with bricks without an architectural blueprint? You definitely can. But an architectural blueprint takes what? I don't know. I never needed one. Probably takes 2 weeks, 1 month, 1 month and a half with reviews. I don't know. Maybe some of you know better. How long does it take to build a house? It can take 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. So if you need to start planning or making decisions based on the final product, imagine that you could only buy a window or choose a door until the house is built, right? Or understand which kind of sofa is going to fit on your living room if you have to wait for someone to put the walls in there. That doesn't seem very practical. And I think historically we've been so quick to the gun to kind of start implementation to get something quick, where today you don't need that. You can leverage a lot, and Postman will help you leverage a lot just from the contract itself. So the blueprint. So in this contract, we've defined the endpoints, we've defined example responses, a lot of detail about the type of parameters, etc. One of the best things we've introduced recently, and I've kept hidden until now, is this rules section in the bottom. So Postman currently ships with a governance and security engine based on Spectral. Some of you might know the open source technology that basically, as a developer, gives me what is commonly referred as linting for APIs, which you're used to use every day in your code, in your favorite language. Postman is telling me that there has been 6 different rules identified that I'm not respecting, of which one actually happens 4 times. And they're important things, like I haven't defined any security field. So in this blueprint, I actually, using the same analogy, I haven't specified which type of lock we're going to use, which doesn't mean someone is going to implement the lock, is that no one at this point knows which kind of security is going to be implemented in this API. For example, the policyholder path has a trailing slash. And if for the developers in the room, you would see how this would be a massive issue if you try to go ahead with this. So the brilliance of this is that if we pick every person in this room and put them in a different team, in a different office in the world, this rules engine is what will be able to guarantee consistency for our customers across the board. Because it's very unlikely that we'll end up with 2 APIs, 2 distinct APIs, or 2 flavors of APIs. If a customer of ours, of our company, we're all distributed, is using one of our APIs, what does it say about our company if you've used ID as letter I and letter D, and you've used identifier, and I used user underscore ID, right? What does that tell to a customer that is using all of our APIs and saying, why are they doing all different? Do these people not talk to each other in this company? Why do the errors look different? Why is this a post and this is a patch? Why is this a 200 and this is a 201? Why did one person decide it? It doesn't speak volumes to the consumers about how we're presenting these API products. So one of the big benefits of this is not just ensuring that we define things and we can actually, through custom rules, and I'll explain where these rules come from, allow you to be standard, but to also follow enterprise-specific best practices that are particular to this company, to our company here. Things that, if, as you know, when you're doing CI pipelines, if you can get a robot to tell you bad code, it's better if some human has to look at it and says, don't do this, please. So should we fix these rules? At some point, but I like to see things breaking, so I'm going to integrate this with CI now. So let's imagine that I really don't want to fix any of those. So I'm just going to say end of Wednesday. This is not the commit I would do, by the way, but just to give you an idea of the time passing, draft schema. Commit and push goes to GitHub. And now I need to obviously hook this up to my CI pipeline. So I created test and automation, and you can see all the CI tools we integrate with, right? And I ask you to remember or to pick 1 or 2 for something I'm going to tell you in a second. So I'm going to choose GitHub Actions. It's doing the OAuth dance, which I'm already authorized. So we're going back here. I'm going to call this the meetup integration. Again, choosing the repository in case for some reason your build was not your build needed to be another repository. So policy holder, and I'm going to connect. So basically now Postman will, this is an API connection. So it's basically going to give me all the builds happening in this repository, right? The coolest thing I find, because I do struggle with this with a lot of platforms, is that if you click configure Postman client, it knows you're using GitHub Actions. So it produces the build configuration for GitHub Actions based on any checkboxes and toggles that you do up here. So I never have to figure out what's the kind of YAML, the correct YAML to integrate with GitHub Actions. I just go to the repository. I'm here, create a new workflow. And this would be, if you wanted if you click Jenkins as the option, it would give you the Jenkins file, etc. So I'm going to create simple workflow. And I'm going to change the branch in the URL. And I'm just going to copy paste what Postman gave me and call it the Postman YAML. And I'm going to commit to the meetup branch and go here into actions. And the value of this is that how many times do you go to GitHub or GitLab or ADO and just do a pull request with a 1-line change? I know I did that for very basic stuff, like never like proper code that I probably should be testing locally. But even if someone is not using Postman or someone is not aware that we've integrated Postman with this repository, if I do a simple pull request, if I just open that scheme in VS Code, and we're working on a VS Code integration, if you just do your changes and push to a branch, you'll be shown this screen, right? Let me minimize so everything is in one line. So the build will break because there's at least one governance or security rule that is of the error type. And if that's the case, your build will fail. And this will guarantee a consistency that is not necessarily just the folks using Postman. This is something that is now plugged into the repository and is going to use our APIs and is going to contact Postman. So even if you didn't open Postman and you created a branch on this repository now, after I merge this workflow, you would be seeing this screen. And this is just the governance and security testing. We haven't started talking about the API testing, the integration testing, the functional testing of the APIs. So this is where I would go back to my API and see that Postman has shown me that I have upstream changes because I basically committed that file directly on the web UI. So it pulls the changes. You can see here, create post YAML. This is very much bread and butter for those that have been using Git for a long time. So now I would go through the rules and it's rechecking the rule violations. If it's taking a bit, it could be a bit about my Wi-Fi, but let me close and reopen. This is a good time to go and show you where these rules come from before I fix them, as it's trying to find the violations again. So an administrator in my company will have access to these two sections on the left side, API governance and security. They pretty much work the same, but they're two different catalogs. That's why we separate them. And you can define different rule sets for different workspaces. So for example, you can have a baseline that all the companies should adhere to, and you apply that to all workspaces. And then you can have different teams with different level of maturity trying to grow through kind of the open API maturity ladder into very reusable schemas and components and stuff like that. These three rules here, we currently have all these rules in our catalog, and they are applied different. This is your whole set currently, so 6, 12, 18, 21 rules, and you can import more, and I'll show you that in a second. But these three ones, which we're actually having issues on the first and the third, for example, we created a custom rule that says that the API description shouldn't contain the name API, right? Simple things to validate, or that the version of an API has to be semantic versioned. It cannot be alpha, preview, or test, or draft. It has to be semantic versioning. These are simple examples, or for example, this one that says property names must use snake case. So this is the breadth of the things you could potentially apply and have linting telling the developers, don't do that because at our small startup, we don't do that, do this instead. What we just did a massive iteration in the governance engine. And one thing I really like is that before we just had the Postman catalog, right? So if you want more rules, you can go into import and you can find the Postman catalog, which has 70 governance rules, and you can import it. So if you want to make sure that APIs must have contact URL or email available, you import and then add to one of the groups that I mentioned, to everyone, to some people, etc. But the truth is, there's a lot of people out there in the industry that have been using Spectral for ages, and they're very good at it. And Zalando is an example of that. So instead of having you to kind of go reinvent the wheel and write these custom rules, literally just go into Zalando's open source repository, copy pasting and bringing it because you like one of their rules. We're trying to bring best of industry catalogs like Zalando's, and this is what they use on the Spectral rules engine. So for example, you can view all their 30 rules, and you can pick and choose the rules you want from Zalando. For example, they have one interesting ones, which are not part of our libraries, which is they limit developers to use a subset of status response codes. And I think this, I never thought about this until I saw it. And there are a lot of nouvelle or quirky response codes that you see and it's like, what is this about? And 99% of the times, you probably need 10 codes for most of your APIs, right? So they have all these rules, and you can just click import, and they become part of your set, which you can then create subcatalogs from for your different workspaces. So if I show you here workspace groups, you can see that there's all workspaces has 11 rules, but then there's a black belt workspace group that has 16 rules applied. It's the one that has more rules applied, and there are 2 workspaces infringed by this. This is a great improvement because when we launched the first iteration of this last October, if I'm not mistaken, it was one for all, and this the feedback was immediate. Like we need to kind of we need to segregate a bit of the rule groups because not everyone is at the same level of maturity, especially in larger companies. So this, as a developer, you would come here and you would see, okay, the policyholder API contains the forbidden rule API. This is a custom rule. You save it, boom, it's gone. And I feel like developers are so experienced to linting this day and age that having to fix these problems at this stage feels comfortable, feels like you're doing the right thing, feels like it's the bots are protecting your legacy as a developer, because this is all helpful stuff that gets you out of trouble. But let's imagine that, I don't know, I just came out of uni. I did 1 or 2 APIs. I have no idea why this cannot have a trailing slash. It doesn't make sense to me. So for our catalogs, not for the custom rules, you'll see this possible fix on the right. And I find this very important to lower the barrier of entry. For every rule in that catalog, you will go into our library and it will actually try to explain to someone how they fix it and why they should fix it. And I find this is very important, instead of having to come here. And for example, when it starts getting things which are a bit more complicated, like operation does not enforce any security scheme, just trying to fix this by Googling, right? Which we all know it can go one of 2 ways, right? So having this library, I feel like it was this was available on the first version. It was a great way to kind of help developers of all experiences deal with this. I'm almost finishing because this would take me another 45 minutes to deploy the whole API, but I want to talk about mocks and dependencies. Instead of fixing this live one by one, I'm just going to get the same snippet, but the final API, which fixes those problems. I think you get the gist. So now you would come here, no rule violations found. I go to my native Git integration, says fixed all issues. You commit and push, and you expect that the next build from GitHub Actions or check-ins, I'll get to you in a second, will pass on that. I was going to wait for the end for questions, but it seems like yours is very pertinent to this. No, so currently only an admin can edit those groups, but we're just about to make a specific role. The same way that we have a role for the public elements, like a public API, we have a role for the private API management. We're going to have a role just for the rule sets. So that will allow us to give the role to more people, because admin. Excuse me? No, so when you import this requires some playing with. When I import a rule from a catalog into this page, it becomes available of the rule set that you can use, right? So this is our universe of rules. So until I go there into all workspaces and add it to, nothing has changed. I could have imported all the rules, which means that now we can make use of all those rules, which is kind of, you could say, oh, just put them all here. But what's going to happen over time is that when we add catalogs and add catalogs and add catalogs, instead of seeing 21 rules, you would see a list with 300, of which 21 had tick boxes. So I think from a user experience, you see, this is the universe of rules. There are 21 total rules that can be applied. So if I import another one, 22 rules can be applied. If they are applied or not, you have to go to workspaces, come here to all workspaces, and this is where you see edit, and you can see which ones are applied. So all workspaces have those 2 custom rules and a few very basic ones, right? And if I go to the black belt, you'll see that they have many more, right? So I think that answers your question. Cool. If my CI CD build is passing, which seems like it is, fixed all issues, I have a contract, right? But Imagine that I have 3 teams waiting for this API. I have this API product, and I'm going to finish talking about API first, which I hope it makes more sense in the end instead of starting with that topic. Imagine that I have Nigel that is trying to validate a mobile client with the product owner. Magnus that's trying to use this API to actually build another API. This is what has forced us, I believe, because I was in the shoes of a developer not long ago, to quickly jump into the implementation, meaning I need to give someone something, right? And to me, mocking has only gone 2 ways. You decide that you're going to mock on the client side, and you're going to do either just dump the data on the web UI, or you actually going to do a mock asynchronous call that returns you always the same thing, right? Or you're going to ask your friend on the server side that's working on this API, can you just get this endpoint to work? And you know how it is. If that developer is going to be working 1 month on that API, that service is going to go down every 30 minutes, right? Or you will get changes like, oh, I've just updated the one you asked me for. It's like kaboom, and it's like, what happened? Oh, I've just implemented all of this and it changed, etc. The benefit here is that we are working on top of a contract of the blueprint that I mentioned. So if we have this blueprint agreed, why can't we just work on top of this blueprint? So the answer to answer your colleague's question was, there's nothing to work with. I just have a schema file. But if we can generate a collection from this definition and call it policyholder, and there's a ton of options here that I won't cover just now, and generate this collection, now I have something you're familiar with. Now I have all the juicy endpoints that you're familiar with that I can just start clicking and getting answers back. But where is this data coming from, right? Where is this? What is this actually doing? Is it on my computer now because I have Postman installed? So this is where you enter, where mock servers enter. So Postman, for a long time again, gives you the ability to mock specific paths and endpoints and methods with a response body. But Postman goes a step further and can just pick up a collection that you have and mock the whole collection based on the example responses you might already have there or might want to generate more of. So I'm going to call this the policyholder mock. And this is not something running on your machine. This is not something running on your desktop app. This is going to give you a real URL that takes real time to come back to. And you can see here, no delay selected. You could actually simulate different delays for this endpoint if you wanted to. And I'm going to create an environment because you want to quickly be able to change from a mock environment to a pre-production environment, etc. And you can even make them private, so no one on the internet would be able, even if they guessed the URL or an employee gave that URL, you could make that private. So we're going to create that mock server, and that's literally an endpoint that will mock all the responses for that API we just created, and this is the URL, right? The only thing the environment does is put this URL into a variable, as you see here, policyholder, which I'm going to leverage in my API, because if you see here, my API has base URL / policyholder, right? So you can see no environment selected. I'm going to select the policyholder. I should have called it policyholder mock, or else it's going to get very confusing. And I click send, and I get a response back. So I get a sample list of all the users, or what get all policyholders. But not that, I have 2 different example responses. I have a success one and a failure one. For the create policyholder, I have a 500, a 200, and a 404 if you're using an ID that doesn't find one. So for example, here on policyholder, I have an example that responds if you say UK 2003. So this is the user that it gives me back. All right, and this is obviously static data. But the beauty of this is that, go back to the way I said we did mocks before. Mock it on the client, mock it on the server. The day that the developer says, I've deployed the implementation to an environment, nothing will work. And we can debate about this, but I'll stand my ground that things will break left, right, and center. If we're only working, if the developers that need my collaboration are working on this, they can test. They can simply get a different answer. If imagine that they're testing happy paths and happy paths, they want to see what would happen on an error. What do I need to change? You can just come here to the headers, and Postman provides a very comprehensive set of headers. So match response name, match code, add a delay. Imagine you have 30 types of example success responses. Then you can match by ID. You can literally change the behavior of the application by passing just a different header, and that will give you a different sample response. So at this point, I would expect myself that has to deploy this implementation to go out. I'm on holiday next week, then I come back and I have to fix some patches. I might have this API implemented in a month's time. Within that, you have everything you need here. You don't need anything else from me. You have it. And now, something we just released last month, which is quite priceless, I won't go into it, or else the meetup my talk will be too long, but we can talk about. I would start writing tests, right? I would start going to the test tab and start augmenting this with tests and chaining the requests and test it. What happens if we change 2 lines in the contract? Because there was feedback from Nigel saying that one of your endpoints doesn't do what it should do. I'm missing data. Back in the day, you would go back to the contract and you would come here and let's do a bigger change. Let's say it shouldn't be policyholder, it should be policy holders, right? Kaboom. So you probably didn't notice, but that this little icon showed up in here that says there are changes to the collection based on recent changes on the schema. So if you click there, you can see that update collection here, and I'm going to click it, and it's going to tell you everything that the impact on the schemas has had. Conclusion is, if we're all working on this contract, we're providing feedback to each other. Forget the implementation. No one has written a single line of code here. We continue updating the contract, the blueprint, until it is the blueprint we need. You regenerate this. The mocks will give you the responses. The endpoints will be updated. And by the time I tell you I have a preview environment ready, the transition should be completely seamless, right? And this is where I would probably stop because it's been an hour. But if you are interested, come talk to me afterwards, because the next steps would be, I'm actually going to implement this. So I have the implementation here in VS Code, and I would pretend 2 weeks have passed and I have final implementation. I create a local development environment. I test that it works. It works. I push those changes to GitHub. We get that environment deployed in the application deployed in Heroku. I share the URL with you to show you that the API is really there. And then we do a very interesting test suite, which basically does leverages Postman testing, automation testing to create a random user, because Postman has something called dynamic variables. I don't know if you're aware of it, which gives you random first names, random addresses, random social security numbers. So we create a unique user every time. We get that same user with the ID that gets retrieved from the database to check that it exists after it was created. We update it to change the first name, and then we get all policy holders, and those requests are chained, right? With those, we have our test suite. We generate the CI/CD configuration to include these tests, and it changes a line or two. And then we merge this to production, and we create a production monitor, right? So monitors is yet another big section of Postman, which basically all the tests you do during your API can be reused to constantly monitor the health of an API. So you write a test suite that tests that you can create, update, delete a user. Those shouldn't just run in CI. Now you can schedule them to run every 12 hours in UAT. You can ask them to run every 24 hours in South America, for example, because you have a lot of customers there. So that's what we would do. And for that, we would probably need another 30, 40 minutes. But this is where we would take the API from one end all to the other. And it would finish by submitting it or trying to publish this to the private API network, which I showed in the beginning, which would allow other people to quickly see this. I wouldn't be able to publish it. I would be able to submit a request to be added to the private API network, because as a curated portal, no one has the big picture, or not in the individual developers. It's hard to understand the big picture of that curated wall. So there is a particular role at Postman that allows you to say, yeah, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense, or this is too low level, this is not important enough, etc. So To finish, where is that link? I want to finish with two things. Historically, and one of the things that pulled me into Postman is to think that APIs have always been seen in the industry as a byproduct of an application. You think about applications, you think about somewhere where someone goes and puts their login data and sees a web page with data, right? And then APIs become a byproduct of that. Oh, but someone needs to do something. Do we have an API for that? Or is there an API for that? When this is the website is API-First Art World, and it's a graphic novel that features our founder and CEO Abhinav that tries to explain this through comics. But basically, what Postman is actually trying to educate and move through is to think about APIs as a product. When you go through this contract, regardless if, and now taking a step back from Postman, regardless of how do you get there, APIs should be seen as a deliverable by itself. What you do with that API afterwards is up to you, right? Because you'll end up doing communication channels between your clients and your servers. The fact is that if you do not document it, if you don't have a structure behind them, it's this internal communication channel that never becomes an API and no one can leverage with, right? So by being API first, it has so many consequences. How many times have you as consumers or as developers supporting applications have had to answer the question, do you have an API for that? And we say, no. Well, but you're doing it on the web page. Where is the API for that? Or if you only give me an API for that, I could do it myself. Or if I had an API for that, I could. And then the questions, why didn't we do an API first? Why did we end up with a web UI and a mobile app, but no APIs? But we do have the communication channels there, the non-interface, the application programming something, which is not an interface, right? And if we can have in this culture of, okay, API is a product. You finish an API, you document it, it's done. Now you can use it to build a web UI, you can use it to communicate with other APIs, you can build a web page with it. Those are different products. And it was funny because if I ask you today, this is a sock question, by the way. There's a joke there to be done with socks as well. But anyway, the protocol. What is the hottest product on the market today? I won't take that as a fully correct answer. But what is everyone talking about these days? ChatGPT. ChatGPT has an interface, right? They do have a web page where you go. But if you go look at OpenAI's pricing page, what you're looking here is APIs. So you see a company that has the hottest thing in the market today, right? In the sense of audio models, image models. How do they monetize this with? APIs exclusively to a large part of these models. Doesn't it seem kind of, why wouldn't they just build something for someone to upload? Because they don't need to, right? And I don't think we're far, and this is a personal prediction, opinions not endorsed by Postman. I think one term you'll start listening to a lot in years to come is API only. In the same way you heard about mobile first, mobile only, etc. You'll see this as APIs because the future is going to a place where we're doing a lot of automation and a lot of machine-to-machine communication, and the web interface is going to lose the place it had with Web 2.0, where everything was a web page, right? Just give me an API, and I can go get into Postman. I can build something with it. But at this point, for a lot of things in my engineering ecosystem, I'll take an API. If you can give me a web page and an API, I'll probably want the API. And I would like a web page, but if I have to choose two, I'll choose the API. So have a read through the comic. I think it explains API first more than I would ever would. Abhinav is great at doing so. If you have any questions, I'll take them now. And thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot, Victor. It was very interesting, I think. Even though I heard the presentation before, I think I liked it.
Yeah, we changed it
even more. Yeah, even more this time.
I did the whole flow of deploying the API and then the tests, etc. But just writing all the tests for those requests, I feel like I would lose half of you doing those tests. But it's something I quite like to do. But people have to welcome that amount of coding in live.
So do we have any final questions here in the room or on Teams? Otherwise, both we and you guys will stick around for a few minutes, I guess. Be open to take questions afterwards.
Yeah, I would love to chat with anyone that has questions offline as well, over the drink or so.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.